The little black girl whispered to the biker that her mom's signature was forged on the discharge papers. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. A little girl ran toward the group of bikers at the corner of the parking lot, her face wet with tears. Her clothes were rumpled, her eyes wide with fear, and her breath came in short, frantic gasps. She barely stopped as she reached the group, but the man at the front of the group, a biker known as Forge, stepped forward. "What's wrong, kid?" he asked in a voice that was low but steady. The little girl grabbed his jacket with trembling hands, her voice barely audible. "They took my mom. They made her sign the papers. It's not her signature." Forge's face hardened. The bikers who had been chatting among themselves immediately went silent, their eyes locking on the girl. She looked no older than 9 or 10, but the panic in her voice was enough to send a shiver down anyone's spine. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Forge asked gently, his hands still on the girl's shoulders. She looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks, and her voice cracked as she spoke again. "The nurse, she told me my mom had to leave, but my mom would never sign those papers. I know it wasn't her. They told me not to tell anyone." Forge's stomach sank. He exchanged a glance with his crew. "Stay with her," he said to one of the bikers, and immediately, one of them, a woman called Crow, stepped up and crouched down beside the girl. Forge turned to the others. "We need to get to that hospital now." The group of bikers, all part of a club known as the Thunderwolves, had spent years riding together, but this was different. This wasn't just another fight or another confrontation. This was about a promise Forge had made 5 years ago, a promise to protect the family of a fallen friend. And now, that promise was being tested in ways no one could have expected. The little girl's name was Maya Jenkins, and her mother had been under the care of the local hospital for weeks. But Forge's gut told him that something wasn't right. They had to get to her, and fast. With a look of determination, Forge grabbed his phone and started dialing. The Thunderwolves were no strangers to danger, but this was different. The stakes were higher now. It wasn't just about defending their reputation or riding through tough terrain. It was about saving a young girl from a situation that had already gone from bad to worse. Forge's fingers hovered over the screen as he tapped out a message to the crew. "We leave in 20. Get ready." As he looked back at the group of bikers, their faces showed no hesitation. They understood the seriousness of the situation. They were a family, a bond forged in fire, and when one of them called for help, they responded. Maya Jenkins was their responsibility now, and they wouldn't stop until she was safe. "I'm coming for you, kid." The tension in the room was thick, and Forge's eyes never left the man standing by Maya's bed. The stranger, clearly not expecting a challenge, took a half-step back but quickly regained his composure. His cold, calculating gaze locked onto Forge's, but Forge wasn't backing down. The promise to Tyrone echoed in his mind. He would keep Maya safe, no matter the cost. The man took a slow breath, his hands twitching at his sides. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered, his tone icy. "I've got every right to take her. She's my responsibility now." Forge's voice was steady, unwavering. "Not anymore. You're not taking her anywhere." The tension in the air was palpable as the man stepped forward, his towering presence looming over Forge. But Forge wasn't intimidated. He'd faced worse situations in his life. His mind raced, calculating his next move, knowing that the stakes were higher than ever. Maya's life hung in the balance, and he couldn't afford to let fear dictate his actions. The man looked at Maya, then back at Forge. "You're making a mistake. I'm her stepfather. I'm the one who's been there for her all these years." Maya's eyes, wide with fear, flickered between the two men. She hadn't spoken a word since Forge entered the room, but her expression said it all. She was terrified. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "He's not my father. He's the one who hurt me." The words hit Forge like a punch to the gut. The man's expression darkened, but Forge didn't flinch. He had heard enough. It was time to act. He stepped forward, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out his phone. "I'm calling the cops," Forge said calmly, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I'm not letting you take her anywhere." The man's face turned ashen, his eyes narrowing with fury. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he snarled, his voice dangerously low. "I'll have you arrested for interference." "Try it," Forge said, his voice cold and firm. "You're not leaving here with Maya, and that's final." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. For a moment, everything seemed frozen, time itself holding its breath as the two men stared each other down. Then, the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway interrupted the standoff. Forge's hand instinctively went to his side, where he kept a backup knife hidden in his leather vest. But as the door opened, it wasn't a cop or security. It was Derek Bonds, the club's lawyer. He walked in with the kind of quiet authority that made even the most seasoned criminals pause. Derek looked at Forge, then at the man standing by Maya's bed. "We need to talk," Derek said, his voice calm but firm. The man's eyes widened when he recognized Derek. He hesitated for a moment, then straightened his posture. "I don't know who you are, but I don't have time for games." "You don't want to do this," Derek said coolly, his eyes flicking to Forge before locking onto the man. "What you're doing is illegal. You don't have custody of her anymore." The man stiffened, his face reddening with anger. "What are you talking about?" "I've already spoken to the hospital administrators," Derek continued. "They've confirmed that the signature on Maya's discharge papers was forged. You don't have any legal claim to her. You're not her guardian." The room fell silent, the weight of Derek's words sinking in. The man stood there for a moment, as if processing the information. Then, with a bitter sneer, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, his voice low with venom. "You're making a huge mistake." The door slammed shut behind him, and the room was left in stunned silence. Maya's face slowly relaxed as the tension left her body. Forge moved toward her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "It's okay now," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You're safe." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and confusion. I don't understand," she whispered. "Why did he do that? Why did he want me to leave?" Forge's expression softened as he crouched down next to her bed. "Because he's a coward," Forge said quietly. "He's been using his power to control people, and he didn't want anyone to stand in his way. But we're not afraid of him. We'll make sure you're safe from now on." Maya nodded, a faint but hopeful smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Forge smiled back, the weight of the past few hours finally starting to lift. He stood up and turned to the rest of the crew, who had been silently watching from the doorway. "We did good," he said, his voice carrying the relief of a job well done. But as Forge looked back at the door, the sinking feeling in his gut returned. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The man may have been gone, but Forge knew that Maya's stepfather would be back. And next time, the fight would be even harder. But no matter what, Forge wouldn't back down. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. Forge stood at the door, his hand resting on the doorknob, his heart still pounding in his chest. The confrontation with Maya's stepfather had gone as expected, tense, but ultimately successful. The man had left, but Forge knew it wasn't over. A fight had just begun, and it wasn't just for Maya's safety. It was a fight for justice, a fight that was personal. He looked back at Maya, who was still sitting on the bed, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket, eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. She was safe for now, but Forge knew that could change at any moment. His mind raced with possibilities. If the stepfather didn't back down, things could get ugly quickly. Forge's thoughts were interrupted by the soft but firm voice of Derek Bonds, the club's lawyer. "You're right, Forge. This isn't over." Derek had been quiet during the confrontation, but now, his words carried the weight of experience. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "The stepfather will be back. He's not one to back down easily, especially with his reputation on the line. But we have something he doesn't, proof." Forge turned to Derek, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Proof?" Derek nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I've already started pulling records. Maya's stepfather has a history, Forge. He's been involved in shady deals before, and I'm willing to bet this isn't the first time he's abused his power. We just need to connect the dots." Forge exhaled sharply, feeling a spark of hope. For a moment, it felt like the weight of the world was lifting. But then, The reality of the situation came crashing back. We can't wait for him to slip up. He's dangerous. He'll stop at nothing to get what he wants, even if it means hurting Maya. Derek's expression darkened. You're right. That's why we need to move fast. The moment he tries to take Maya again, we'll have the leverage we need to take him down. Forge looked at Maya, who was now looking at Derek with wide eyes. You're sure you can protect her? She asked quietly, her voice trembling. Derek kneeled beside her, his tone soft but firm. Maya, we're going to make sure you're safe. We won't let anyone hurt you, not as long as we're here. Maya nodded, her expression still uncertain but hopeful. Forge's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned back to the door. He could feel the weight of his promise pressing down on him. He had to keep her safe, no matter the cost. We need to stay ahead of him, Forge said, his voice low. If he's planning something, we have to be ready. Derek stood up, adjusting his glasses. I'll keep digging, Forge. We'll get everything we need. But we need time, and we need to stay calm. Forge's jaw tightened. Time isn't something we have. We need to act now. Derek met his gaze, his expression serious. Then we start now. I'll contact my sources and see what we can uncover. But you're right, we can't waste any time. Forge nodded, his mind already racing with plans. Get back to work, Derek. We're going to need everything you've got. Maya, you stay here with Crow and the others. We'll make sure you're protected. Maya nodded again, her small shoulders seeming to relax just a bit. Forge turned to leave, but Derek stopped him. Forge, there's something else. Forge raised an eyebrow. What? Derek's voice dropped to a whisper. I've been looking into Maya's stepfather. There's more to him than meets the eye. He's not just a cop with a temper. He's tangled up in something bigger. Forge's pulse quickened. What are you saying? Derek leaned in closer. I think the man's involved in something illegal. Something he's trying to keep under wraps. If we can find that connection, we can bring him down for good. Forge felt his stomach twist. If this was true, it meant that Maya's stepfather wasn't just an abusive man. He was part of a much larger problem. Forge's eyes narrowed. Then we need to find it. Fast. Derek nodded, and Forge turned to leave the room. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, but Forge wasn't about to back down now. Maya was under his protection, and nothing would change that. As Forge stepped out into the hallway, he signaled to the rest of the crew. Gather everyone. We're going to need all hands on deck. The crew nodded, their faces grim but determined. This was no longer just a fight for Maya's safety. It was a fight for justice, and they were ready to go to war. Forge walked down the hallway, his mind focused on what came next. They would bring Maya's stepfather to justice. He wouldn't rest until that promise was fulfilled. Forge's mind was racing. The more he thought about Maya's stepfather, the more unsettled he became. Derek's words kept echoing in his mind. This wasn't just about an abusive man trying to take a child. This was something bigger, something deeper. As Forge walked through the hospital's sterile hallways, the weight of responsibility pressed down on him. Maya's safety was his responsibility now, and he wasn't about to let anyone take her away, not without a fight. He had made a promise, and that promise meant everything. But Derek had a point. Maya's stepfather was dangerous, not just because of his violent tendencies, but because of the power he held in this town. He was a cop, well-respected, a pillar of the community. That meant he could make things disappear. If Forge wanted to take him down, he had to play it smart. The Thunderwolves weren't just a group of rough bikers. They were a family, a network of people who had each other's backs. But they weren't a law enforcement agency. They couldn't just barge into a place and take matters into their own hands, no matter how much they wanted to. The stakes were too high. He had to think carefully. Forge approached the elevator, his phone vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Derek. I've got something. Forge's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This could be the breakthrough they needed. He tapped the message open, his eyes scanning the screen. I've traced some of the financial records. There's a pattern. Maya's stepfather has been funneling money through a series of shell companies. I think he's involved in a bigger scheme. You need to come to my office. I'll explain more. Forge's pulse quickened. If Derek was right, this wasn't just about abuse. This was about corruption. Forge had been in enough battles to know when something wasn't right. He couldn't wait. He had to act fast. He sent a quick message back. On my way. As the elevator doors opened, Forge stepped out into the cool night air, the harsh lights of the parking lot casting long shadows. His bike was parked at the far end, the chrome gleaming under the streetlights. He walked toward it, his boots clicking on the pavement, his thoughts focused on what was to come. When he reached the bike, he pulled his helmet on, securing it tightly. The Thunderwolves were already gathering, their bikes lined up in a row, engines idling. Forge could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about protecting Maya anymore. This was about bringing justice to a man who had abused his power and used it to manipulate the system. He couldn't let that slide. He started the engine, the roar of his Harley breaking the stillness of the night. The other bikers followed suit, their bikes echoing in the parking lot like a symphony of rebellion. As Forge revved the engine, he looked over at his crew. They were ready. They knew what was at stake. This was about more than just Maya. It was about taking down a corrupt system that had allowed people like Maya's stepfather to operate with impunity. Forge took off, leading the pack down the empty road, the wind whipping past him as the desert stretched out before them. The miles passed quickly, and soon they were in town, heading straight for Derek's office. As they arrived, Forge parked his bike outside, his boots hitting the pavement as he dismounted. He walked into the building, the rest of the crew following close behind. Derek was already there, his office dimly lit, papers scattered across the desk in front of him. He looked up as Forge entered, his expression serious. "It's worse than I thought," Derek said, his voice low. "Maya's stepfather is part of a larger network. I think he's been using his position to cover up illegal activities. This isn't just about him being a bad stepfather. It's about him being a criminal." Forge's jaw clenched. He had known something was off, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a family drama. This was about an entire system being manipulated by someone who should have been protecting the community. "What do we do now?" Forge asked, his voice tight. Derek leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We expose him. We use the evidence we have to bring him down. But we need to be careful. If we go in too hard, we'll just make him dig in his heels and make it worse for Maya. We need to approach this strategically." Forge nodded. He knew Derek was right. They had to play this carefully. But one thing was for sure. Maya was not going back to that man. Not now. Not ever. "Let's move," Forge said, his voice filled with resolve. "We bring him down, Derek. We make sure Maya's safe." As the group of bikers geared up for the next step of their mission, Forge couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility settle deeper in his chest. But he also knew one thing. They were in this together. The Thunderwolves weren't just a group of bikers. They were family. And family always had each other's backs. The tension was mounting as Forge and the Thunderwolves MC stood outside Derek's office, ready for the next move. They had just received confirmation that Maya's stepfather was involved in a much bigger web of corruption, and now it was time to strike back. Forge's mind was clear, his determination solid. He couldn't let Maya's abuser get away with this. Not after all the lies, the manipulation, and the suffering Maya had endured. The time for playing nice was over. The biker crew was ready, but Forge knew that this wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. They were going up against a man who had power, influence, and connections. They had to be smart, strategic. As the engines of the bikes roared to life, Forge glanced at Derek, who had pulled together all the evidence they needed to expose Maya's stepfather for the criminal he was. "We've got one shot at this," Derek said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "If we do this right, we can take him down. But if we don't, he'll slip through our fingers, and Maya will be the one to pay the price." Forge nodded. "We'll make sure he doesn't get away with this. We have to do it right." They couldn't just charge in guns blazing. This had to be calculated. They couldn't afford to mess this up. As the group of bikers mounted their Harleys, Forge took one last look around, making sure everyone was ready. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had made a promise to Tyrone, and now, that promise meant everything. "All right, let's go," Forge said, his voice calm but commanding. The Thunderwolves MC took off into the night, their bikes cutting through the darkness with a sense of purpose. The road stretched out ahead of them, empty and desolate, but Forge's mind was focused on the task at hand. They had to get to Maya's stepfather before he could do any more damage. They had to expose him for the criminal he was. As they rode through the quiet streets of the town, Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He wasn't paranoid, but something didn't feel right. He scanned the area, his instincts on high alert. But everything appeared normal. The Streets were quiet. The few cars that passed by didn't seem to pay them any attention. But Forge knew better. They were up against a man who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to keep his secrets buried. They had to stay one step ahead. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of town. Forge slowed down, his bike coming to a stop in front of a rundown building. This was it. Maya's stepfather's hideout, the place where he ran his operations, the place where all the dirty secrets were buried. This is it, Forge said, his voice low. Everyone be ready. We move in fast, no mistakes. Derek nodded. I've got the files with me. We can use this to bring him down once and for all. The bikers dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The sound of the engines was silenced, and the night felt still, almost eerily so. Forge signaled to the crew, and they began to move toward the building. As they approached, Forge could feel his pulse quicken. This was it. They were going to confront Maya's stepfather, expose his corruption, and make sure he could never hurt anyone again. But Forge knew they had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. The door to the building was old, rusted, and barely hanging on its hinges. Forge pushed it open slowly, the creak of the door echoing in the quiet night. Inside, the room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a few desk lamps. There were papers scattered across the floor, old files, and documents, evidence of the man's shady dealings. Forge's eyes scanned the room, taking it all in. They were looking for one thing: proof. Proof that Maya's stepfather was involved in illegal activities. Proof that he wasn't the man he claimed to be. They had to find that proof before it was too late. There, Derek said, pointing to a file cabinet in the corner of the room. Forge moved toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened the cabinet, his hands shaking slightly as he rifled through the papers. Then he found it. A file marked with Maya's name. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the evidence they needed. As Forge pulled the file out, the door to the building slammed shut behind them. Forge spun around, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his side. But it was too late. Maya's stepfather stood in the doorway, a smug smile on his face. I knew you'd come for me eventually, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Forge stepped forward, holding the file in his hands. You've been hiding behind your badge for far too long, he said, his voice cold. But not anymore. You're going to pay for everything you've done. Maya's stepfather's smile faded, and for the first time, Forge saw the fear in his eyes. The man had been in control for so long, but now, the tables had turned. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, he spat, his voice shaking with anger. I have connections. I can make all of you disappear. Forge stepped closer, his eyes locked onto the man's. You're done. This is over. With that, Forge slammed the file onto the table in front of the man. The evidence was there, undeniable. And there was no way out. Maya's stepfather had been caught. This ends here, tonight. The biker's words were final, and as Maya's stepfather realized that his power had no weight here, he hesitated. The room was silent except for the hum of the nearby fluorescent light, the tension rising. This is your last chance, Forge continued, stepping closer. Give up now, and maybe we can make sure you get a fair trial. Keep fighting, and you won't walk out of here at all. There was no defiance left in the man's eyes. He looked down, the weapon in his hand now lowering. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Forge saw the weight of the fear in him. I didn't mean to hurt her, the man mumbled, almost too quietly to hear. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing? Forge echoed, incredulous. You thought forging signatures and threatening a little girl was the right thing? You thought that abusing your power to manipulate people was the right thing. The man didn't respond, his eyes dropping to the ground. There was nothing left to say, but Forge wasn't finished. He stepped forward and placed the file onto the desk with a sharp thud. You're a coward. You took advantage of your position to hurt people, and now you're going to answer for it. Maya's stepfather let out a deep breath, as though the very weight of the truth had taken all the fight out of him. Forge's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and quickly scanned the message. Derek had been working on the final pieces of evidence. It was time to act. You're coming with us, Forge said, his voice hardening. The man's eyes lifted, panic creeping back in. What are you going to do with me? We're going to make sure you face justice, Forge replied. And we'll make sure Maya is safe. You won't be able to touch her again. Just as Forge reached for the man's arm to guide him out, the door to the room swung open. Crow, one of the Thunder Wolves, stepped inside with a look of urgency. Forge, we have a problem. Forge turned, his heart racing. What is it? Crow looked over at Maya's stepfather. His friends, they're on their way here. They've got backup. Forge cursed under his breath. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. But they weren't. Backing down now. Get the bikes ready, Forge ordered, his voice sharp. We're not running. We're going to face them head on. Maya's stepfather took a shaky step back, his eyes widening. You can't do this. They'll kill you. You're outnumbered. I'm not afraid of them, Forge said, his tone cold. And I'm not letting you go. Not after everything you've done. He turned to the rest of the Thunder Wolves, who were now gathering in the hallway, ready for what was coming. The sound of motorcycles revving outside echoed through the building. They were coming. Forge didn't flinch. This wasn't just about a few bikers defending one another. It was about something much larger. It was about standing up to a corrupt system, about making sure that power didn't go unchecked. Maya had been through enough. It was time to make sure that this nightmare finally ended. The sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder as the enemy closed in, but Forge and his crew stood tall, unwavering. Stay close, Forge instructed. We'll make sure Maya is protected, and we'll end this tonight. The Thunderwolves MC stood strong, knowing that the next few moments would determine everything. This was their fight, and they weren't going to back down. As the first group of men approached, Forge stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. You made a mistake when you came after her, he said, his voice filled with quiet fury. Now you're going to regret it. The enemy bikers stopped short, their eyes taking in the group of Thunderwolves standing strong. There was no fear in Forge's stance, no hesitation. This was it. The moment of reckoning. This was where everything changed. The tension in the air was unbearable as Forge and the Thunderwolves MC stood face to face with the approaching group of men. The roar of their engines echoed through the night, a reminder that the enemy was here, and they were here for a fight. Forge could feel the heat of the moment rise as the two groups locked eyes, but there was no fear in his crew. They were ready, and Forge knew they had no choice but to stand their ground. This was bigger than just a confrontation. It was about ensuring that justice was served and that Maya would never have to face her abuser again. The man who had tormented her was going to pay. As the enemy bikers dismounted, Forge's gaze moved over each of them, sizing them up. These weren't just ordinary bikers. These were people with power, influence, and connections. But Forge didn't flinch. He had been through worse. He had faced down men who thought they were untouchable, men who thought they could hide behind their badges, their wealth, their influence. But tonight was different. Tonight, Forge and his crew were the ones in control. You don't want to do this, one of the men sneered, stepping forward with a menacing look in his eyes. You don't know who you're messing with. Forge didn't respond right away, his gaze steady and unwavering. He had no time for empty threats. He had a job to do. You're right, Forge finally said, his voice calm but firm. I don't know who you are, but I do know this. You're about to make a huge mistake. You're standing in the way of justice, and that's not something we're going to let slide. The man who had spoken before smirked, clearly unimpressed by Forge's words. You think you can take us down? We have the law on our side. We have the power. You're nothing but a bunch of outlaws. Forge didn't flinch. You don't have power here. This is about Maya. This is about right and wrong. And you know it. The man's smirk faltered, his eyes flicking briefly to the other bikers and his crew, as if seeking reassurance. But Forge didn't back down. If you don't leave right now, things are going to get ugly. And I'm not talking about just tonight. I'm talking about everything you've done to get to this point. You're not invincible. The law won't protect you forever. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The enemy bikers were weighing their options, but Forge could see the cracks forming. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They weren't as confident as they appeared. We're not leaving, one of the other men said, his voice gruff. We're here to take what's ours. What's yours? Forge asked, his voice calm but laced with disdain. You mean the right to keep abusing your power and manipulating people to get your way? Is that what you're claiming? The man stiffened, but Forge didn't give him a chance to respond. He stepped forward, the other Thunderwolves MC members falling in behind him. The enemy bikers took a step back, clearly caught off guard by the boldness of Forge and his crew. Listen, Forge said, his voice low but forceful. We're not here to fight with you unless we have to. But we will. And if you think for 1 second that we're going to let you take Maya away, you're wrong. This tonight. The enemy bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the atmosphere growing more charged with every passing second. The tension was palpable, and it seemed like the slightest spark could set everything off. But Forge wasn't worried. He had the truth on his side, and that made all the difference. You really think you can win this? One of the men asked, his voice thick with disbelief. You're outnumbered. Outclassed. Forge's expression remained calm. I'm not worried about numbers. I'm worried about what happens to Maya if you walk out of here unchallenged. And I'll be damned if I let that happen. With that, Forge reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, sending a quick message to Derek. It's time. We've got the evidence. Bring it. The man's eyes narrowed, realizing that they were playing with more than just fists. Forge had what they needed to bring the man down for good. The fight wasn't just physical, it was going to be a legal battle, too. You're finished, Forge said quietly, his voice deadly calm. And so is he. The enemy bikers froze, their expressions shifting as the gravity of the situation settled in. The man who had been so confident before now seemed unsure, looking over his shoulder at the others for support. You don't want to mess with us, one of them warned, but Forge didn't waver. I don't want to mess with you. I want to make sure you can never hurt anyone again. The sound of motorcycles revving in the distance signaled the arrival of Derek, who pulled up alongside Forge with a small team of lawyers and investigators. The Thunderwolves stood ready, their eyes locked on the enemy. This wasn't just a fight for Maya's safety, it was a fight for justice. Forge took a step back, signaling the rest of the crew to hold their ground. They weren't moving until Maya's stepfather was brought to justice. The enemy bikers seemed to realize they had lost. With a final glance at Forge, they retreated, mounting their bikes and speeding off into the night. The battle had been won, but Forge knew this was just the beginning. The real work was only just starting. The dust had barely settled when Forge and his crew watched the last of the enemy bikers speed off into the night. Their retreating engines faded into the distance, leaving behind only the faint hum of their motorcycles and the heavy silence that followed. Forge stood there for a moment, his chest still heaving with adrenaline, as he took in the aftermath. They had won. The immediate danger was over. But Forge knew it was far from finished. The real battle was just beginning. Turning to his crew, Forge's gaze swept over them. There were no words necessary. They had stood their ground, fought for what was right, and had protected Maya. But there was more to be done. We're not done yet, Forge said, his voice steady but firm. We have the evidence. Derek's working on the legal side, but we need to stay on this. We can't let this man slip through our fingers again. Derek had arrived shortly after the confrontation, bringing with him a team of legal professionals and investigators who had already begun working behind the scenes. The file Forge had handed over earlier was full of damning evidence. Corrupt financial dealings, forged signatures, and connections that tied Maya's stepfather to a much larger criminal network. But there was still the matter of the legal system. Maya's stepfather was powerful, and the road ahead would be long and complicated. As the rest of the Thunderwolves gathered around, Forge felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He had promised Tyrone, and now he was keeping that promise, but the fight wasn't over. It wasn't just about protecting Maya anymore. It was about making sure the corrupt system that had allowed this to happen was brought to its knees. We'll ride out tomorrow, Forge said, breaking the silence. We'll make sure Maya gets the support she needs. But first, we need to get this evidence into the right hands. Derek, can you handle that? Derek nodded, already pulling out his phone. I've got contacts who can take it from here. We'll start the process. It won't be easy, but we have everything we need. Good, Forge replied. We've got a window, but it's closing fast. Let's make sure we use it. With that, Forge turned and began walking toward his bike. The crew followed suit, and soon the parking lot was alive with the sound of roaring engines once again. As Forge revved his bike, he looked back at the hospital. Maya was safe for now, but she still had a long road ahead of her. He wouldn't let her face it alone. The ride ahead was more than just a mission, it was a promise. The Thunderwolves MC headed out into the night, their lights cutting through the dark like a beacon. The road ahead was unknown, but Forge was determined to make sure that Maya and her mother would finally get the justice they deserved. As they drove, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on Forge's mind. There was still a lot to do. They needed to make sure Maya was safe, get the legal system to act, and, most importantly, make sure the people who had exploited their power were held accountable. The thought of Maya's stepfather still haunted him, but Forge knew that with the crew by his side, they could take him down. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Maya's story wasn't the only one. There were countless others out there who needed someone to fight for them. And the Thunderwolves would be there for them, too. The miles rolled by, the sound of the bikes reverberating through the empty desert. Forge could feel the tension in the air, but he knew it was nothing compared to what was to come. As they approached the town, the moonlight cast long shadows across the road. Forge's grip tightened on the handlebars as the reality of the mission set in. They were going to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. They were going to make sure that no one else would ever have to face what Maya did. The Thunderwolves pulled into a secluded area, their bikes lining up in formation. It was time to plan their next move. The fight wasn't over, but Forge was more determined than ever. With Maya safe for now, they could focus on what came next, exposing the corruption, taking down the criminals, and making sure that justice would be served. As the night sky stretched above them, Forge knew that this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight, but it was a fight he was ready for. With the Thunderwolves by his side, he was unstoppable. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Forge and the Thunderwolves MC gathered outside their temporary base of operations, a small, nondescript warehouse on the edge of town. The morning air was crisp, but Forge could feel the weight of the days ahead pressing on his shoulders. The night had been long, and though they had taken a significant step forward, the war was far from over. The enemy wasn't just a single man anymore. It was an entire system of corruption, and Forge knew that it would take everything they had to bring it down. They had the evidence, they had the support of the law, and they had the resolve to fight for what was right. But Forge also knew that there was no room for mistakes. Maya's safety was still their top priority, and though the immediate threat had been neutralized, her stepfather's allies were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike back. Forge looked around at his crew, each member of the Thunderwolves MC standing tall, their faces set with determination. They had all signed up for this fight, but now the real test was upon them. He needed to make sure they were all prepared for what was coming. "We've got a lot to do," Forge said, his voice steady but commanding. "We need to make sure the legal side is covered. Derek's working on that, but we also need to be ready for whatever comes next. Maya's stepfather isn't done yet. He's got connections, and we can't afford to let our guard down." Derek, the club's lawyer, stepped forward, holding a stack of papers in his hands. "We've got everything we need," he said, glancing at the file. "But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more time he has to cover his tracks. The best thing we can do now is use the momentum we've built and make sure Maya's safe while we take down everyone involved." Forge nodded. "Agreed. Let's get to work. Maya's safety comes first, but we're not stopping until we've taken down everyone who's part of this. I don't care how big they are or how powerful they think they are. We do this right, and we end it for good." The crew dispersed, each member moving with purpose, knowing exactly what needed to be done. They had all trained for this, but now it was real. The weight of the responsibility was heavy, but they weren't about to back down. Forge walked toward his bike, the sound of engines revving behind him. They weren't just riding for justice. They were riding for something bigger. As Forge mounted his bike, he could feel the rumble of the engine beneath him, a reminder of what they were about to do. They were heading straight for the courthouse, where the final battle would take place. The plan was set. The evidence was in their hands. All they had to do now was execute. As the Thunderwolves rode in formation, Forge's thoughts turned back to Maya. She had been through so much already, and now it was time to make sure she had a future free from the terror her stepfather had put her through. She was safe for now, but Forge knew it would take more than just protecting her in the moment. They had to make sure she was safe for the rest of her life, free from the shadows of her past. Forge pushed the throttle, feeling the wind rush past him as the miles rolled by. The Thunderwolves were a family, and they were going to make sure that Maya never had to face that monster again. The courthouse came into view, and Forge's heart rate quickened. This was it, the final showdown. He knew the man would try to escape, try to manipulate the system, but Forge wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. As they pulled into the parking lot of the courthouse, Forge dismounted and looked over at Derek, who was already making calls to secure their position. "You ready?" Forge asked. Derek nodded, his eyes sharp. We're good to go? I've got the judge's attention. Now we just need to make sure the authorities know everything. He won't get away with this. Forge glanced at the rest of the crew. Let's move fast. We've come this far. We finish it here. They moved in unison, their steps purposeful as they entered the courthouse, a sense of urgency in the air. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The halls echoed with the sounds of footsteps and distant conversations, but Forge's focus never wavered. This was a fight for justice, and they weren't leaving without a victory. Derek led them through the building, making their way to the courtroom where the trial would take place. The scene inside was everything Forge had imagined, tense, with lawyers preparing their arguments and the judge sitting at the bench, ready to begin. As they took their seats, Forge's gaze locked on Maya's stepfather, sitting at the defense table with his lawyer. The man's eyes met Forge's, and for a brief moment, he saw the fear in his eyes. It was clear the man knew his time was running out. Derek stood up, speaking to the judge with authority. Your Honor, we have new evidence that directly implicates the defendant in a series of illegal activities. We ask that the court take immediate action. The judge looked at Derek, then at the defense team, before nodding. Proceed. As the trial began, Forge sat quietly, his heart pounding as the prosecutor laid out the case against Maya's stepfather. The evidence was undeniable. The man had forged signatures, manipulated the system, and abused his position of power to hurt innocent people. But it wasn't just about the legalities. It was about justice. And today, justice would be served. The courtroom was tense. Forge sat in the back, his eyes fixed on the front where the trial was unfolding. Derek had done his part, presenting the evidence with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. The judge, an older man with a stern demeanor, had heard it all before. Cases, lies, manipulation. But today, something was different. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Maya's stepfather was sitting at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn. His once confident posture had crumbled, replaced by the nervous fidgeting of a man who knew his empire of lies was about to collapse. The prosecution's opening statement was powerful. They laid out the case with undeniable clarity, showing the forged signatures, the financial records linking Maya's stepfather to a web of corruption, and the testimonies from witnesses who had seen his true nature. The defense, however, wasn't backing down. The lawyer for Maya's stepfather was quick to object, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that it didn't directly link the defendant to the crimes. But Derek wasn't backing down either. He had anticipated this. Your Honor. Derek stood up again, his voice calm,
but commanding. The evidence we've presented isn't just circumstantial. We have financial records, witness testimonies, and the defendant's own admissions. This isn't a case of speculation. It's a case of undeniable guilt. The judge nodded, his face expressionless. I'll allow the motion, he said. It was a small victory, but it meant that they could move forward. Forge couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. He had fought for this moment for so long. But now that it was happening, there was a lingering doubt in his mind. Maya had been through so much already, and he couldn't shake the fear that the system, despite everything, might still fail her. The trial continued, and Forge listened as the prosecution laid out their case. Every word felt like a step closer to justice, but also a reminder of the battle ahead. Maya's stepfather was a man who had abused his power for years, hiding behind the badge and using his influence to get away with his crimes. But Forge knew they had the truth on their side, and the truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how much the darkness tried to swallow it. After hours of testimony, the prosecution rested their case. It was now time for the defense to speak. Maya's stepfather's lawyer stood, a slick smile on his face as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the evidence. You've heard the accusations. But let me ask you this. How do we know any of this is true? How can we be sure that these documents haven't been tampered with? That these witnesses aren't lying? His voice was smooth, practiced. He was trying to plant doubt. Forge felt his fists tighten. It was a tactic that all too often worked. A last-ditch effort to discredit the truth and give the guilty a way out. But this time, Forge wasn't going to let it happen. As the defense continued with their arguments, Forge couldn't take his eyes off Maya's stepfather. The man sat there, staring at the floor, his earlier cockiness completely gone. Forge knew what was coming. The moment they had all been waiting for. Derek had made sure they had all the pieces in place. And now, it was time for the final blow. After a brief recess, Derek stood again, his posture straight, his expression one of quiet determination. Your
Honor, we have one more piece of evidence, Derek said. He pulled a document from the folder in front of him and handed it over to the judge. It was the final nail in the coffin. The document was a recorded conversation between Maya's stepfather and a known criminal associate, discussing the manipulation of court documents and the forging of signatures. The room fell silent. The defense attorney stood motionless, his mouth slightly agape as the judge examined the document. Forge's heart pounded in his chest as the judge looked up. "This is the smoking gun," the judge said, his voice heavy. "The court will now take a brief recess to deliberate." Forge's stomach churned. The trial had been long, the tension unbearable, but this was it. The moment they had all been fighting for. Maya's stepfather was finally going to pay for what he had done. But as Forge stood up and walked out of the courtroom for the brief recess, he couldn't help but look back at Maya. She was sitting in the front row, her face pale but determined, her eyes locked on him. It wasn't over yet. They still had to win. And Forge wasn't about to let anything, anyone, take this away from them. Not now. Not when they had come so far. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge returned from deliberation. The Thunderwolves MC sat in the back, their eyes fixed on the front, waiting for the final verdict. Forge could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This had been a long journey, one filled with uncertainty, fear, and hope. But now, they were so close to the finish line. Maya was sitting next to Derek, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her face pale but resolute. She had been through so much, but she was here, standing strong. Forge couldn't help but look at her, feeling a deep sense of pride. She was the reason they had all fought so hard, the reason they had stood their ground against a system that had failed her. The judge finally took his seat, his gavel in hand. "We have reached a decision," the judge said, his voice firm, his gaze sweeping over the room. "The defendant has been found guilty on all charges. The evidence presented has left no doubt as to his involvement in the crimes he has been accused of. He will be sentenced accordingly." A wave of relief washed over Forge as the words sank in. The man who had tormented Maya for so long was finally going to pay for his actions. The room erupted in a quiet murmur as the realization hit everyone. Justice had been served. But Forge wasn't done yet. He had promised Maya something more than just a conviction. He had promised her safety, peace, and a chance at a normal life. He looked over at Derek, who gave him a brief nod. The battle was far from over. Maya's stepfather may have been convicted, but there were still the people who had enabled him, the ones who had allowed him to operate without consequence for so long. Forge wasn't about to stop now. As the judge continued with the formalities of the verdict, Forge turned to his crew, signaling them to gather. There was work to be done, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. The trial may have been a victory, but the fight was still ongoing. After the verdict was delivered, Forge and the Thunderwolves left the courtroom. Maya, now with a sense of relief on her face, walked with them, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She had come so far, and Forge could see the weight lifting off her shoulders. She was free now, free from the grip of a man who had stolen so much from her. Forge placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "It's over," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. Maya looked up at him, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Forge smiled, his heart heavy with emotion. "You don't need to thank me. We're family, and family always looks out for each other." As they exited the courthouse, the fresh air outside felt like a new beginning. Forge looked around at his crew, each member of the Thunderwolves MC standing tall, proud of what they had accomplished. They had fought for Maya, and they had won. But Forge knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. There would be more corruption to uncover, more injustices to fight against. But for now, they could breathe. For now, they had done the right thing. Maya's future was still uncertain.
But she was no longer alone. Forge and his crew would stand by her, just as they would for anyone else who needed them. The Thunder Wolves MC wasn't just a club. It was a family, and they had each other's backs. As the crew prepared to leave, Forge took one last look at the courthouse. The battle had been long, but they had won, and as they climbed onto their bikes and revved the engines, Forge knew this was only the beginning. There would always be more to fight for, more people to protect, but as long as they had each other, they would keep going. Forge took one last look at Maya, who was now standing tall beside him. Her future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape, and Forge would make sure she had every opportunity to live a life free from fear. With that, the Thunder Wolves MC roared to life, riding off into the horizon, knowing that no matter what came next, they were ready to face it together. The sound of the motorcycles echoed through the quiet streets as Forge and the Thunder Wolves MC made their way out of the town. The battle was over, and they had won. Maya's stepfather was behind bars, and the evidence had been enough to expose the corrupt system that had allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. The sun was setting in the distance, casting a golden hue over the road ahead. But Forge's mind was still racing. They had fought hard, but there was always more to be done. Maya had been through so much, but now she was free, and Forge couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. She was no longer in danger, and she had a future ahead of her, one that was hers to shape. But Forge knew that there were many others out there who still needed help. The Thunder Wolves had only just scratched the surface. As the bikes rode through the quiet night, the wind whipping past them, Forge's thoughts turned to the future. The fight for justice was never over. There would always be more people to protect, more battles to fight, but as long as he had the Thunder Wolves by his side, he knew they could face anything. The crew had become more than just a group of bikers. They were family, and family always had each other's backs. Forge looked over at Maya, who was riding next to him. Her eyes were still a little red from the tears of relief, but there was a strength in her that Forge hadn't seen before. She was no longer the scared, vulnerable girl she had been when they first met. She was strong, and she had a future to look forward to. Forge smiled, his heart swelling with pride. She had made it through, and now it was time for her to rebuild. "You did good, Maya," Forge said, his voice steady but soft. Maya looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engines. "You saved my life." Forge's smile faded slightly, but his expression was still warm. "You did that, Maya. You made the choice to reach out, to fight. That's what makes you strong." As they continued their ride, Forge thought about all the people they had helped along the way. The ones who had been forgotten, abandoned, or ignored by the system. The Thunder Wolves had given them a voice, a chance at justice, and that was something Forge would never take for granted. They rode through the night, the highway stretching out before them like an endless road of possibility. There was no destination in mind, just the freedom of the open road, the promise of tomorrow, and the certainty that they would always fight for what was right. Forge's mind wandered back to the man who had caused so much pain. Maya's stepfather was just the tip of the iceberg. There were more like him out there, hiding behind their power and influence, taking advantage of those who couldn't defend themselves. But Forge knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had the Thunder Wolves by his side, and together, they were unstoppable. As they rode through the night, Forge's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Derek, the club's lawyer. "The wheels are already in motion. The case is solid, and the investigation is gaining momentum. We'll make sure no one else falls through the cracks." Forge's heart lifted. This wasn't just about winning one fight. It was about making sure the system changed. That people like Maya's stepfather couldn't hide in the shadows anymore. Forge put the phone back in his pocket and looked ahead. The sun was rising, casting a soft glow over the horizon. It was a new day, and with it came new possibilities. The Thunder Wolves had done what they set out to do, but the journey wasn't over. There was always more work to be done, more people to protect, and more battles to fight. But Forge was ready. As the bikes roared down the highway, Forge felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had fought for justice, and they had won. But more importantly, they had fought for each other. And that was something no one could take away. With the wind in his hair, the open road ahead of him, and the Thunder Wolves at his side, Forge knew one thing for sure. They would always be there, no matter what came next. The fight for justice never ended. But with family by his side, Forge was ready to face whatever came next.